Welcome to our Vanderbilt Divinity School webinar and the 2023 Mafoi Carlisle Bogitsh Memorial Lecture. My name is Emily Towns and I am Dean of the Divinity School. This lecture was established by a gift from Professor Emeritus Burton Bogitsh and his family in honor of Mafoi Carlisle Bogitsh, who grew up as a Baptist in a small farming community in West Texas, where her mother, Una Hopper Carlisle, taught her the principle of religious tolerance. Mafoi studied comparative religion at Baylor University and cultivated a profound interest in various worlds and world religions and the cultures from which they arose. This interest grew when she married Burton, a man of Jewish heritage, and both involved themselves in the Unitarian tradition. The Mafoi Carlisle Bogitsh Memorial Lecture honors her lifelong interest in the interplay between culture and religious expression. This year's Bogitsh lecturer is Alexis Wells-Oghoghomeh, Assistant Professor of Religious Studies at Stanford University. Her first book, The Souls of Womenfolk, The Religious Cultures of Enslaved Women in the Lower South, won the 2023 Outstanding First Book Prize from the Association for the Study of Worldwide African Diaspora and was a finalist for the 2022 Frederick Douglass Book Prize. She is currently at work on a second monograph that traces the gendered, racialized history of phenomena termed witchcraft in the United States, as well as a 2-volume documentary history of religion and slavery. Her work has been supported by the Ford Foundation, Mellon Foundation, and Forum for Theological Education, among others. She received her BA in English from Spelman College, the Master of Divinity degree and PhD from Emory University. From 2015 to 2021, she was a member of the Religious Studies faculty here at Vanderbilt University. Welcome home. The title of her lecture is More Than a Slave: Enslaved Women, Religion, and New Histories of Black Humanity. After the lecture, we will have a question and answer time, so please put your questions in the Q&A and we will try to get to all of them. Professor, the screen is yours.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dean Towns, for that lovely introduction and for the invitation to come back to Vanderbilt. One of the things that I wrote to Dean Towns and Shatika Brown, who graciously helped to organize all of this before I wasn't able to come, was that it's kind of, of course, I never want my husband to get hurt. However, my children were so upset with me that they could not join me in Nashville that it's almost good. When I picked them up from school today, they were like, okay, so you didn't go without us? So I won a lot of mommy points back for not coming to Nashville without my kids. But it very much is a homecoming. Of course, so many of you out there, I haven't had a chance to see who's on the call, but I was really, or on the Zoom, but I was really looking forward to coming back and just seeing so many familiar faces. So I'm really grateful for this opportunity to be in conversation about what I'm thinking about. And I do want to preface this by saying, I think that's one of the amazing things about being able to give this talk in a space that I love and know so well is that I feel like it's a good venue for thinking about the ways that the scholarship intersects with what's happening around us. So much of what Vanderbilt Divinity School does and my old department, Vanderbilt Religious Studies, thinks about are these intersections. And so currently I'm in a space where I'm thinking about it, how histories of enslaved people and their religiosity speaks to what we're seeing around us. Tyree Nichols' graphic video had come out not too long after I was asked to give my title. And so this is where I was and where I think I am going to be for a while, and really where I've always been. So grateful to be back, and I'm going to do some screen sharing, and bear with me because even though we all did this during COVID, for whatever reason, I've lost my touch. So I am going to see if you can see that. That is not what I wanted it to do. I'm going to have somebody tell me, can you see that? Thumbs up. I can't tell if my screen is visible or not. Anybody? Thumbs up? Oh, let me look in the chat. No? Okay. All right, let me try that again. Let me do it like this. And then sorry about that. I use double screens, and looks like this desktop is not the one you can see. All right, let's try that again. Can you see that now? Sorry, the silence is sort of, okay. Yes, okay, thank you. All right, I'm going to just, sorry about this. This is always kind of my learning curve when I'm on my home desktop. I do not normally work here. So I do not, this is not my space. This is usually my husband's space. Okay, so you can see this. I am going to, actually, I'm going to stop sharing and make sure it's enabled for sound, and because we do have some media. Sorry, everyone. No. Shatika, one question. So this is not giving me an option to share sound or video. Is that okay? Is that okay? Are you still going to be able to see it? I'll just share it anyway. Let's just get started.
You should be able from your computer, if you have sound, if you have the video from your computer, we should be able to hear it.
Okay. All right. And let me make sure. All right. And you can see my my PowerPoint.
Right now we see your notes, your talk.
What is going on?
I'm sorry.
Okay. No, it's okay. It's okay. I'm not sure what's happening, why you can't see. All right. I will give the PowerPoint. Let's try it this way. Yes, no.
It's in presenter mode.
Okay. This is going to stump me here. Let me just change my display then, because I'm not really clear why this is not allowing me to. Thanks. Please stay tuned. I'm sorry, everyone. Turn off my screen mirroring. The way it's displaying. All right, well, I'm not really sure how to take it off of, how to get you all on the correct screen.
So right now we just see a picture of the boys.
And right now, can you see the screen?
We can.
Okay. And not really sure how to get to my notes from here. I'm gonna try it. I'm not sure why it's showing you my notes instead of what I'm telling you to display. But if this persists, we will just rock with it. I'm not really, are you seeing my notes or the correct screen?
I see the notes.
Okay. I don't know how to make it where you don't see my notes unless I do that. Now you see the correct screen.
I see just the presenter view, but I don't see your notes.
Okay, well, we'll rock with that. Okay, I'm sorry, everyone. I'm not really clear why this is. I have presented at this screen, and this has not happened before at this desktop. So I'm not really sure what mode we're in right now. But as long as you can, let me take it off of presenter view. So we can take that off, then we can start. So I wanted to start off talking about how I came to choose the there we go. How I came to, I'm not sure how to get it out of presenter view.
There you go.
All right, there we go. All right, we got it. That is not. Do you see my notes or the zip? You see?
I see the presentation. I mean,
Okay,
notes, just
we got it. We got it. Thank you, Shatika. And I'm so sorry, everyone. I promise you, maybe it's been a long day. My husband had surgery this morning, and we don't have a sitter, as some of you can hear. And I have literally been running to this point. So I'm going to chalk up my ineptitude with Zoom to that. And I hope this does not continue. So I want to begin, again, thanking you all for being here. And thank you for bearing with me through the technical piece. I unfortunately did not have time to run through anything because his surgery, I was sharing with Shatika, he had a bad reaction to the anesthesia and ended up taking longer to get out than we expected. So so you're getting this, it's raw in that it's unrehearsed, but I think very much also, like I said, in the moment that we're thinking about anti-Blackness, thinking about the political moment, what's happening in Florida, which is my home state. All of these moments and movements and debates that are swirling around us, and what this has to do with the history of enslaved people. So as I approach the completion of my book, The Souls of Womenfolk, like so many people, I was asked by the editorial team at UNC Press to suggest some potential cover images. And since the book was about the religious lives of enslaved women in Georgia and South Carolina, I knew that I really wanted a book cover that attested to the complexity of bondwomen's inner lives, a cover that really represented them, not as the one-dimensional figures, or as I see it, one-dimensional figures predominantly known as slaves in popular and academic historiography, but rather as humans who experienced childbirth, who raised their children, who loved, who laughed while enmeshed in one of the most brutal systems in human history. As I went in search of these images, images appropriate to convey these ideas that were so critical to understanding what I was trying to do in my work, I was met with some very familiar and problematic tropes. Fueled by anti-slave trade and abolitionist narratives, the vast majority of the depictions of bondwomen presented the varied abuses perpetrated against them at the hands of human traffickers and slaveholders. A number of the images spoke to the voyeuristic sadism that threaded through abolitionist literature, designed to represent the violence of enslavement while appealing to gendered conventions around women. Images like this one, oh, sorry, I lost my notes, depicting a Captain Kimber who was accused of torturing a 14-year-old girl to death for not dancing naked for him, were as salacious as they were heinous, and appealed to European and American fascination with African and African descendant women's bodies and sexuality. After another such death of a young enslaved girl, Kimber was tried in British court, but acquitted when it was determined that the girls allegedly died of malnourishment and not the abuse. The slide, sometimes the sadism was not overt, but rather covered just beneath the surface, as evidenced in this depiction of women being branded on the coast of Western Africa. While branding was not a popular practice as the slave trade grew in size and popularity, it was practiced by slaveholders on both sides of the Atlantic and spoke to the shift in status, the understanding of enslaved people as human property, shift in the status and shift to this understanding of enslaved people as human property that characterized the slave era. Punitive scenes populate the slavery archive, characterized by bond people in various states of undress, while slaveholders and others beat them mercilessly, usually for minor infractions. This enslaved teenager in Richmond, Virginia, was 15 or 16 years old when she was locked in a room and burned repeatedly by her mistress for upsetting her. She was apparently clinging to life when she was found. And if you look at this image, you'll notice that she's propped very precariously on the chair because she was also burned along her backside, going completely along her back. Images like these from those depicting spectacular acts of violence to, as many of us have probably already seen, something like this, seemingly more mundane scenes of public auctions that punctuate contemporary articles about enslavement in the United States spoke to the historical context in which enslaved people lived and breathed and continue to shape, in my estimation, continue to shape understandings of who enslaved people, who the so-called slave was. Scenes of violence, mutilation, humiliation, trauma overwhelmingly shape how we understand this figure called the slave. And you'll notice I always put that terminology slave in quotation marks, and when not in quotation marks, use the language of enslaved people. And this is a convention that many slavery historians adopted some time ago, meant to remove the abstract culpability that is sort of attendant to this idea of the slave. When we talk about enslaved people, there's an action, there's an actor enslaving them, whereas slave itself kind of connotes this, again, an unseen abstract force, almost just in my work, an ontological state of being that is just who they were supposed to be and not something that was done to them. So all of these scenes are punctuate, define, help render legible this category of the slave. And so after sifting through all of these images, I obviously chose this one. This is Thomas Anschutz's The Way We Live. As you can see, it was painted in 1879. It was actually painted in West Virginia, not Georgia or South Carolina, where I situate my work. And it was painted over a decade after the end of slavery. And I always kind of preface thinking about my work with this story about the cover image, because it was so difficult to find. I sifted through hundreds of images. It took me 3 months to even find this one image to convey what I wanted to convey about who enslaved women and enslaved people writ large were. Since the inception of the system that displaced and colonized humans in one locale for the production of goods in another, the term slave has been used to describe the persons whose physical, intellectual, and reproductive resources supported a rapidly expanding global economy. Though the discursive treatment of the persons bearing the designation has changed over time, the residue of its ontological significance persists. Enslaved persons often appear in scholarly and popular literature as undifferentiated, violated bodies who largely resided on the periphery of historical processes until their emancipation catapulted them into the role of actors. That is, as evidenced by the images of bondwomen, their status as enslaved people marked them as those who were acted upon, often violently and with impunity. The omissions effectively rendered the enslaved almost inanimate, perpetually trapped within the enslaved free paradigm in which varied forms of sociopolitical freedoms are requisite for personhood in historical memory. And I do want to underscore that point. When we talk about enslaved people, we oftentimes tell stories of those who escaped. We tell the stories of those who left. We tell the stories of liberation. And as some of you know, I'm heavily influenced by the great womanist theologian Dolores Williams, who I always say, even though she wasn't a slavery historian, she got it right. The vast majority of people who were enslaved never left. So we have to tell the story of those who did not leave and not just the stories of those who did. The question we're considering today is, how can methodological approaches that study and emphasize the inner lives of enslaved people in the US invite new paradigms for new paradigms for racial justice and new histories of Black humanity? And for me, they go hand in hand. So to begin this conversation about this question, I want to start with an abbreviated visual journey through the history of slavery. The goal here is not only to point to the historical conditions that characterize the lives of bond people depicted in the images, but also to invite us to meditate upon the work the images themselves perform. With these images, I am not merely trying to offer a visual accompaniment to my words, but rather pointing to the relationship between history and historiography, how the images themselves shape the narratives we tell about the people in them. Moreover, true to our topic, it's an invitation to reflect upon scholarship and scholarly work, methodology and history, how our experiences of them, what we choose to see of them being the images, what we choose to see and not see, our assumptions, guide the questions we ask about the people in the images. From this visual journey, I move to a brief consideration of the religiosity of the enslaved and how in the attentiveness to the material conditions of enslavement, centering their experiences, even when their voices are absent, can push back on the methodological and categorical legacies of the one-dimensional slave. I center the experiences and voices of enslaved women primarily, and I do this in all of my work, the new work on witchcraft, which we can talk about. And I do need to say this is sort of this is where I am. And I see this question of enslaved humanity is the question my work is always answering. It's always about in thinking about the ways history can help us see interiority. And so really the talk is thinking about the meta question that guides all of the work, all the things I'm thinking about. And I center in all of these questions, the experiences and voices of enslaved women, primarily to suggest how different reading practices can do the work of rehumanizing those who already knew themselves to be human. And rehumanizing, the work has to happen for us. Sorry, I am going to move past the introduction, but we have to rehumanize them. And we is a collective we. Me as a descendant of enslaved people in the American South and the Caribbean. I don't think this is just the work of larger racial structures. I think this is the work that a lot of people have done in inadvertent ways, and work that we have to undo in how we start to rewrite these histories. Finally, I end with a series of provocations that are less conclusions than ellipses as we think together about how the work of the university, the humanities in particular, can contribute to global conversations about racial justice, how humanizing enslaved people can be another step in deconstructing the abiding legacies of anti-Black humanity upon which the system of slavery depended. So with that, I want to think about this visual history. The system of transatlantic slavery did not begin in North America, but rather on the shores of West Africa, where bond people were often captured in manufactured wars by larger neighboring polities and marched to the coast, or navigated, put on canoes and kind of sailed via rivers to meet potential buyers. The aptly named Vigilante, which is here on the screen, was one of many French enslaving vessels that continued to traffic humans after Britain ended the slave trade in 1808. Captured by the Royal Navy in 1822, there were 345 enslaved people aboard the vessel, which sailed from Nantes, the primary trafficking port in France. According to the Maritime Museum, which holds the record, the Navy captured 6 other French and Spanish vessels in the same raid, which attested to slave trading, the power of slave traders attested to slave trading power's dependence upon enslaved laborers for the success of their American ventures. Here you can see males were generally shackled together using irons. You can see the irons there in the upper left corner, while females and children were often left unshackled on account of the reduced likelihood or supposed reduced likelihood of insurrection. Both were generally kept below deck in the hold of a ship, as evidenced by the historical rendering of the of another vessel, the Henrietta Marie, which is not, it's not on here. Adult males and females, I think I took that slide out to make it quicker. Adult males and females alongside children. And this is just, I know these are probably things that many of us know, but again, as a part of this visual journey and this centering of experience, I'm always asking us to think beyond the statistics and think about the material conditions and how they interact with interiority. Adult males and females alongside children were stripped of their clothing upon capture and the interior to rob them of any cultural, religious, regional, and status identifiers as they marched to the coast. And due to the potential for females in particular to increase the wealth of slaveholders via their West African slaveholders via their agricultural and reproductive labor, they were usually sold within either the West African arm of the trade or the Trans-Saharan arm, prior to making it to the coast where European, American, Brazilian, and other enslaving vessels waited. Oh, here we go. This is I did have the Henrietta Marie here. So here, I want you to see in this cross section, you can see how the women, this one, you've probably seen something like this. This is a cross section here as well, but how people were packed in there. I think between the two and what you already know, you see how big the cargo hold might have been and how people would have been situated underneath it. So here, this is a time lapse of the transatlantic slave trade. And as you see these dots, the dots represent the movement of enslaved people. from West and West Central Africa to the Americas. And of course, you see up top the year. As you watch this, I ask that you think about this as not only numbers and kind of being overwhelmed by the numerical movement of people, but also the movement of ideas, the movement of skills, the movement of resources, the movement and disruption of families, of lives interrupted, and that will have to be remade in new places. Okay. So again, when looking at that, it's an invitation to think differently about what we know of as slavery and how we experience data about enslaved people. Always thinking not just in terms of the overwhelming kind of, again, the statistics, the macro, but thinking in terms of the intimate and the interior, and what the effects of these mass movements would have been to a individual groups of people, but also to groups of people as kind of the larger collective of the people who would bear the label of enslaved, and then Negro, well, African, Negro, Black, and so on. An estimated 12.5 million people embarked enslaving vessels for a life of unfreedom in unknown places. Of the known voyage, only an approximately 10.7 million enslaved people disembarked. An estimated 2 million people either died of willful or forced starvation, disease, murder, or suicide. So again, put a human face of on the dots that you saw. Think of the adults and the children who, as we saw in the rendering, folded their bodies into the holds of enslaving vessels. Consider the noxious fumes of human excrement, body odors, tears, the confusion, the fear, the anguish that characterized this experience. And then think of the girls and women gendered people who most often suffered the gaze, touches, and assault of the primarily men gendered people who'd been at sea for weeks or months. Those who gave birth in the holds of ships, those who experienced morning sickness in these same holds, those who had miscarriages in those holds, those who feared for their lives and the lives of their children. So this is all a part of attaching a human experience to the 12.5 million number. And upon disembarkation in what would become the US, all would be sold, though only an estimated, though only an estimated 400,000 disembarked from West and West Central Africa, millions were moved in the intra and interstate slave trades, which persisted after the end of the British slave trade in 1808. And the one thing to say about sale, and this is, again, just I always prioritize the material conditions of enslaved people before we move to thinking about religion, because you can't understand what they understood, how they defined religion without understanding the circumstances that they found themselves in, the condition of their bodies. Sale was often akin to death. I do not subscribe to the idea of social death. You know, I always say people who talk about social death don't know anything about religion, but it was death in the sense of it was like a loved one dying. The likelihood of seeing someone again was very slim. And laws like the fugitive slave law reduced the likelihood that escaped loved ones could ever visit again. So questions of enslaved humanity lay at the very heart of this institution, with new concepts like race emerging both via religious substantiation and as a religious category. And so moving to think about and this is the fugitive slave law, very briefly kind of, so now we have the material piece, now kind of moving very briefly to think about the religious piece, and thinking about slavery, enslavement as a religious institution. Through the signification of captive bodies as religious outsiders, Christian authorities sanctioned human trafficking amid Enlightenment discourses on rights and the decline of European feudalism. In the very famous 1455 papal bull regarding Guinea, which is sub-Saharan Africa, Pope Nicholas famously granted Alfonso of Portugal license to, as you can see here, invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and so on, Muslims and pagans, and to quote, reduce their persons to perpetual slavery. 4 decades later, the Treaty of Tordesillas, which is actually what you see a historical map of the Treaty of Tordesillas here on your right, divided the world between Spain and Portugal and affirmed Christians' divine rights to land and people. So using the concept of paganism, Western European Christians defined religion's foil. And that's by defining what religion was not, i.e. what Africans did. Not all, you know, because a lot of West Africans, particularly in Congo, converted to Christianity, and even along the coast. European powers contoured what religion was in the modern era. So in the modern era, I don't think you really can understand religion as the category that we wield when we use the category in our academic spaces. We cannot really grab it in the modern eras, because I do think the Islamic context gives us something to think about, to think very differently about how religion emerges prior to the 16th century. But as we wield it in I think predominantly in these spaces, the academic spaces, it is very much entwined with this particular moment, this moment of the rise of global capitalism, the rise of colonialism, the rise of transatlantic human trafficking. Notions of enslavability depended upon narratives of atypical humanity that were often gendered. As Western European economies grew increasingly dependent upon West and West Central African labor, prejudiced ruminations on the so-called natural roles and performances of males and females substantiated claims of Africans' fitness for enslavement in racializing discourses. So unsurprisingly, women's childbearing and child-rearing practices were frequently marshaled as evidence of the innate ability of African-descended people. In his account of the Gold Coast, which is modern-day Ghana, one Dutch traveler surmised that the women of the region neither lied abed for a month nor used midwives to, quote, put them into the childbed and to make them feel comfortable, end quote, as Dutch women did when birthing. Instead, this is according to this Dutch man-gendered Dutch category, traveler. African women, in his estimation, quote, just walked away after giving birth and drank a mixture of oil and grain. According to him, and this is a quote, this shows that the women here are of a cruder nature and stronger posture than the females in our lands in Europe. For the very day after giving birth to the child, they go and walk again in the streets and do their things just like the other women, as if nothing happened, end quote. Again, man-gendered individual. And I'm going to stop doing these, but it's very suspicious that he's commenting on this, because neither in Europe nor in West Africa would you see a lot of men around in childbirthing rooms. They usually weren't there. So he's assessing this based on seeing a woman go in pregnant, seeing her come out with a baby, and what she does afterwards. He also linked West African children's physical prowess to women's childbearing practices, asserting that children, quote, speak and walk much earlier than our children, our being Dutch children, on account of the practice of mothers paying the children, quote, little attention and allowing them to crawl and walk about. So you can see very, very early on, many of the narratives, the racialized gendered narratives that recur in the contemporary context are predominating this early colonial literature, pre-colonial literature. As historian Jennifer Morgan has shown, perceptions of West African women's cruder nature and stronger posture in regards to childbearing and child rearing shape racial discourses via the trope of what she calls meaningless and mechanical childbearing. And this is a trope that populated early traveler writings. These travelers peddled these racist images of African and Native American women breastfeeding their children over their shoulders. And if you haven't read Jennifer Morgan's Laboring Women, it's an absolute must read. It's one of the most influential books upon my work. And it talks about the ways childbearing and child rearing, they are enmeshed. These discourses are enmeshed in what's happening with racialization, how we get the category and the meaning of Negro and Blackness. It's enfleshed by these types of narratives. So these ideas of them breastfeeding over their shoulders, alongside ideas of their excessive fecundity, offered evidence that women, indeed the entire Negro race, were uniquely suited for intense manual labor. Also, the one interesting thing to note that this idea of women giving birth without pain, one of the things that I found in my research on West and West Central Africa is that not all, but in some of the cultures, birth is considered the woman's battlefield. And so just like you show kind of honor by going into battle without showing fear, it's the same thing that some of these women were doing. So it's really just this moment of cultural contact and misunderstanding, because some of the women would, obviously they're feeling pain, but they don't show it. So it's kind of a different kind of cultural code around pain and labor. And of course, without this display of pain, these women were understood to be outside of the curse of Eve, which is presented in the first book of the Hebrew Bible, because pain, of course, in childbearing is one of the marks of the fall. And so in the absence of this, African females were not women within the Abrahamic gender mythology. And as non-women, captive females could be subjected to forms of labor, spectacles of violence, and reproductive imperatives that would have been beyond the pale for European women. And so when you couple this with the very famous Curse of Ham, which claimed that African descended people were the descendants of Ham and therefore divinely ordained to serve their European descendant counterparts, it becomes clear how enslavement depended upon the operation of race and gender in accordance with religious logics that were proclaimed to be both historical and historicized via the circulation of this imagery. So for me, for me, and all of those doing the work of narrating the lives of violated human subjects, the methodological question is, how do we demarcate our categories, in my case, religion, and access interiority among pre-colonial, colonized, and violated people using the very intellectual apparatuses that have been integral to historical acts of violence and colonialism. These intellectual apparatuses, specifically modes of categorization, ways of defining religion, and of producing knowledge, have not only authorized historical violence, but also enforced a type of intellectual colonialism that shapes how the cultures of historically marginalized subjects are translated into knowledge in academic spaces. Consequently, some historical subjects are more legible than others, and this legibility often corresponds to the subject's proximity to the center from whence canonical theory and method emanate. So for me, this center is both epistemological and embodied, not just about how knowledge is defined in the epistemological sense, but who gets to define it. Moreover, whose bodies, experiences, and epistemologies are marginalized, recolonized, and erased in the process. As a historian, who studies religion among enslaved African descendant people, particularly women, these are the methodological and theoretical questions that preoccupy my research and my teaching. Is it possible to apprehend the religiosity of a people whose very appearance as Negroes and Africans in modernity was predicated upon Western Christian epistemes that normalize this hierarchicalization of humanity alongside the categorization of new plants, animals, and geographies? That's a very long question, which I am very fond of. But in short, like the question is, how do I access the religious psyches of people created using historian of religion Charles Long's term, by the very tools I use to understand them? Okay, so the tools of the academy, the tools of academic research are emerging. They're emerging in this moment. The categorization of human, plants, animals, geography. This is what's happening in this moment. We still use those same tools. So how do I use those tools to understand the people who are subjected to these practices? And this is a real question that I'm thinking about, and I think a lot of us think about. I want to very briefly turn to this is a very, very quick case study of an enslaved woman's religiosity to model kind of how the methodological tools through which I think their experiences become legible. And this is a very brief example. These tools are rooted in historical experiences of the body and the mundane, and show with brutal clarity the relationship between methodology and the lived experiences of the historically violated, which are necessary for understanding their complex humanity. So when asked about her method for raising children, there's one formerly enslaved Georgian woman by the name of Carrie Nancy Fryer, who reported that all her children grew up straight because she, and this is a quote, swept them 9 times for 9 mornings from the knee down on out, that away, and bathed them with pot liquor and dishwater. She also reported that she used sassafras to make blood purging teas in the spring and administered water from a horse trough to cure whooping cough. Moreover, when she did not possess the ritual and medicinal repertoire to address a problem, she entrusted the care of her children to another woman who did. Nancy's daughter was born with a boil, which in Nancy's words was, quote, as big as an apple. When an old healing woman came to get Nancy's daughter to take her to the corpse of a lady that had died one morning, Nancy did not want her child to go to the death house, but relinquished her anyway. The elderly woman passed Nancy's daughter across the corpse 9 times and then down the corpse an additional 9 times, in the process curing the child of her wind. In response, sorry if you can hear the music, my oldest child really loves. In response to the memory, Nancy declared matter-of-factly that there, quote, ain't no use talking. And she refers to the elderly woman, straighten my child, her and the Lord. She concluded her recollection with a word on the protocols that rendered the ritual efficacious, saying, quote, you got to do it before the corpse gets cold, just after the breath passes out of the body. These women's religious cultures are neither absent nor hidden in the sources, but rather rendered largely illegible by historiographical definitions of religion that privilege theology over cosmology, systematization over improvisation, and intellectualism over sensuality and definitions of religion. Rendering them being these practices legible requires an attentiveness to the material realities of enslavement that shape their performances, as well as, to quote anthropologist Elizabeth Pettis, the stylized expression of sentiment, corporeal regimes, affective registers, and the culturally specific configuration of sensory faculties and apprehensive modalities called the sensorium. Enslaved women's religions bespoke the rigors of child rearing and slavery that required maternal figures to acquire knowledge of medicinal and spiritual therapies for common ailments. And I should say that and shouldn't, I need a word for both, because medicine and many West and West Central African cosmologies and epistemologies is spiritual and practical and medicinal in the contemporary sense. So acquired knowledge of medicinal and spiritual therapies for common ailments, and the centrality of these women to the transmission. Let me start that over since I put a caveat in there. Enslaved women's religions bespoke the rigors of child rearing and slavery that required maternal figures to acquire knowledge of medicinal and spiritual therapies for common ailments, and the centrality of these women to the transmission of ritual, pharmacological, and cosmological ideas to members of enslaved communities. And I just want to say here that how we can ground this in material realities, and I am nearing the end here. Enslaved children died at twice the rate of their white counterparts, despite all of the rhetoric about fecundity and the hardiness of African descended people. And in 1849, in the 1 year between 1849 and 1850, enslaved children under the age of 9 accounted for over half of the deaths among African Americans in 7 slaveholding states, despite constituting a little over a quarter of the same population. So nestled in this account of Nancy is a concern for her children, the fear for their safety, a desire to see them live, and a resourcefulness born in community. And these child mortality statistics are not unrelated to religious studies and historical theory and methods, but rather remind us of how notions of religion have been marshaled to demarcate the so-called primitive from the civilized, to racialize and hierarchicalize human bodies, and to legitimize enslavement and colonialism through narratives of Christian beneficence and human progress. In short, religious studies and historical methods, some of which we teach in our classrooms and use in our work, are not and have never been benign. Instead, they have had real and often deadly historical consequences for the people upon whom they were predicated. As we've seen, philosophical explanations of the Christian curse of Eve and African women's positions outside of the curse enabled racialized theories of painless childbearing and hardy children, despite evidence to the contrary. Hegelian notions of mastery and slavery are shaped by Western Europeans' encounters with real historical people. British parliamentary debates around the abolition of the slave trade, circulating travel accounts, and centuries-long encounters with enslaved Africans in Europe. The lives of the enslaved people that I study, those whose experiences are often situated as tangential to canonized religious studies and historical theory, cannot be disentangled from the philosophers, sociologists, anthropologists, theologians, theorists, and others whose theories rendered them marginal, rendered them, enslaved people, marginal. Attention to the material conditions of historical bodies, those of our canonized theorists and others, offers a first step towards humanizing those whose experiences and bodies have been rendered marginal and violable across space and time. Grounded in historical realities, real stories, real lives, theories and knowledge are held accountable, and notions of a center, of modes of relationality that render some essential and universal and others marginal and localized, are revealed not only to be unstable, but also untenable. Equally importantly, for those of us who study these historically marginalized people, grounding in material realities forces scholars to reckon with how non-canonical religious voices and orientations speak back to the canon in historical space and time. The violence of the discursive, social, and all these other structures in which they existed required enslaved women to be survival-oriented in their religious orientations. The definitions of religion and survival you hear, again, that's Dolores Williams. Survival and quality of life is absolutely the theory of enslaved religiosity we all should be working with. That is what they lived. That was absolutely it. The definitions of religion they lived and espoused were shaped by the rigors of their labor and the myriad forms of violence, physical and discursive, perpetrated against them and their children. And so this is what made their religious practices often diffuse, improvised performances that created ritual knowledge, like what you heard with Nancy, in response to new challenges, rather than these tributaries of systematized ritual regimes that we oftentimes associate with enslaved religiosity. So Nancy may or may not have been aware of the protocol that healed her daughter before the older woman took her child to the corpse. Think about this. In the aftermath of that encounter, Nancy possessed an understanding of the proper execution of the healing rite that she didactically relayed. So I only get this information because Nancy, the third party, is saying this to an interviewer during her Works Progress Administration interview. So she is transmitting this knowledge. And no doubt her daughter and other members of the enslaved community got it the same way. So these mundane, woman-transmitted, non-institutional modes of religiosity become legible only through a decentering of disembodied, decontextualized concepts of historical and religious studies method and methodology. So put differently, for the scholar, the religiosity of women like Nancy appears only through deprioritizing centralized religious authority, institutional structures, and theology, and a refocusing upon humanity, particularly how human experiences are shaped by and through the imposition of theoretical, epistemological, and categorical frameworks. And so this is not to say that theology, institutional structures of religious authority are not a part of it, but I think we get too caught up in those things. And that is not their preoccupation at all. So the study of enslaved women, as I conclude, the study of enslaved women's material realities and centering of their experiences demonstrate how attentiveness to our field's entanglements in racialized and gendered histories of violence has the potential to counterbalance their colonial methodological legacies. And of course, as a historian, I am attracted to the idea of going straight to the sources, beginning the conversation with the voices and experiences of religious people themselves, as opposed to with scholars whose theories emanate from their contact with religion, most often religious others. The voices of enslaved people and experiences into academic conversation reminds us of the potential violence, both historical and intellectual, of the theories and methods we bring into our own work and into our classes and into everything that we produce. Specifically, capacity for thoughts to erase and violate real people in historical time and memory, and how we as people who love these studies perpetuate this violence every time we consider our use of these things as ahistorical abstractions, as benign. Yet, amid all of these thoughts, I am pulled back by questions about the purpose of this. What is the purpose of the canon? And the centrality of the standardized thought, practice, and method to the identity of a field. In the spirit of this talk, my objective here has not been to tie up my thoughts into a neat bow, as you might have guessed, by all of the caveats. In fact, I really am actively resisting the urge to create a cohesive narrative in favor of a series of questions and provocations inspired by the people that the people whose lives I endeavor to narrate. In short, I am trying to model an approach to humanizing, which is inherently messy, just as colonialism and enslavement are messy. Yet in resisting a neat narrative in favor of historicity and humanity, I am more aware of the challenges of moving this method beyond my body and a theoretical kind of talk to a methodology that guides how I read sources, narrate history, and teach religious studies. What does this look like in practice? How do we create frameworks through which we can wrestle with the messy historical legacies that render certain identities, epistemologies, and bodies illegible as theoretical interlocutors, while also contouring the parameters of their thought within a field? Or does humanizing the historically dehumanized require a reorientation of purpose and what it means to do scholarly work in the first place? So to conclude, I want to end here with an image and invite you to sit with it. This is an image from the WPA sources of a formerly enslaved woman. And consider how her thoughts, history, and interiority remake how we think of Blackness, humanity, and our responsibility to racial justice. Thank you.
That is known as a tour de force.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. There's just, there's a wealth of stuff that you are working through and the kinds of challenges, working on the level of somewhat a self-critic of the field, a critic of the field, but then also an astute observer of images and texts. So I'm going to thank you for giving us so much to think about. I could go on, but that will have to be for another time, because I do believe we have some things in the Q&A and in the chat. Let's see. You reference the book, Laboring Women, Reproduction and Gender in New World Slavery by Jennifer L. Morgan. So that information is in the chat. For those who would like to see it, you now have it. So do click over and see what's going on. Interestingly enough, with all these folks, there are no questions. So I will keep going on until someone joins me in asking the questions. One of the things that I started thinking about as you were nearing the end of your lecture is W.E.B. Du Bois's famous critique of "we don't do history. We want perfect men and perfect situations, and we don't tell the truth so that we have a kind of pristine US history," which of course is not true. If it's people, it's going to be messy no matter what. But I want to sort of piggyback on Du Bois's critique and ask about the work of Black historians in looking at the materials. If you're like me, so I could be projecting, but if you're like me, after a while, you start to have physical reactions as you're reading through the histories. And they're not good reactions as a rule. Every once in a while I may get lucky. how do you as a historian, I don't believe in objectivity either. I think we may strive for it, but we rarely get there. So how do you as a historian manage both the intellectual and emotive that goes on when peeling back the layers of Black history in the US or in the diaspora, probably better put?
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Dean Towns. And I appreciate that because I honestly, I love that question. I get it quite often because the work is so graphic. And I love it because I do think that a part of more of us sharing in this labor is us sharing how we do it, sharing in it, having community around this work, having spaces to emote. So that's one of the ways I do it, but I do think that it's a part of a deeply spiritual responsibility that I feel to the people whose lives I'm narrating. I actually, my American family is entirely from Georgia, South Carolina, and Florida. Every single one. We have all, I guess me and my aunt are the two furthest away, but most of my family, that's where we are, right? They're mostly in Florida where I'm from, but Georgia, South Carolina, Florida, we really don't move, west of the Mississippi. And we definitely did not move west or north, even after emancipation. So these are my people, these are my people. The only ancestor, of course, many of us can trace is like that last ancestor before emancipation. He was in Sparta, Georgia, and then moved to Apalachicola, Florida, which is where my great-grandfather was born. So a part of how I do this work is understanding that it's an imperative that the ancestors' stories be told, and be told in a way, I think, it's not just telling the story, but it's told in the register that they thought in. And I think there are very few beyond, people who, religious historians, we're trained to study interiority. We're studying where the immaterial and the material meet. That is what we do, what we're trained to do. But I think a part of what we haven't done well in narrating the histories of slavery across fields is prioritize their interiority and ask the question of what they thought. How did they define religion? And as I went into those sources, I began to see that their definition is so much, they had a theory, they had a method. We're not attentive to it, and we're not letting them be the voice, be the theoreticians. So for me, the work, it's hard. Obviously, as you said, the effects are heavy. I share my thoughts, I have amazing mentors, you among them, people who supported me, Laurel Schneider, people at Vandy, people like around the country who allow me to speak out the pain. Dr. Tracy Hucks and Diane Stewart, like these are people, Anthea Butler. I can call the roll of people who, Sylvester Johnson, Yvonne Sherrill, like these are people who have created space for me to speak through the emotion. And I think that's critical. And then I think also knowing why you do the work, and as you know, I do the work because they knew they were human. And when I say we, I'm talking about my actual localized we as a Black American descendant, have allowed the shame that the external world felt for what was done to them to define how we think about them. Instead of thinking about them as these incredibly complex, creative, resilient, masterfully resourceful human beings, who created in the midst of the trauma. How? The question is, how do they do that? We've got to tell these stories, you know, and I think they're speaking now. They are, there's a reason why, like, there's so many people, all of us, like the work on slavery, the work in Black religion, the work is just exploding, and it's phenomenal. And I think they're speaking, they're wanting the stories to be told. They're finding all these ways to use us to tell the story. So that's what motivates me. And there are stories I don't tell, stories that I've read that were too painful to tell. And I always say, the ancestors showed it to me for me to, maybe one day I'll tell somebody about it, they'll go back in, you know, that person will go back into that archive and tell that story. Every story is not mine to narrate, but community is pretty much how I do it.
Thank you. We primed the pump, so we have several questions now. So I will read them in the timestamps they came in on. From Skip Armistead, in the video of the slave trade in 2 minutes, so many went to the Caribbean. Was that a holding station or a trading post that delivered enslaved people to other locations?
That's a good question. Neither. So the Caribbean, you know, you have the French, you know, French, Spanish, and British Caribbean. My dad's side is personally from the British. I guess the dad and my mom, they're from the British and the French, Spanish Caribbean, but that's where most people went. And before slavery becomes an established enterprise in North America, it's really the Caribbean. I mean, you think about it, what is it, Columbus, 1492, Columbus is not in what will become the United States, you know? So the Spanish Americas, and along with Brazil, you know, with the Portuguese moving into that, because in that slide of the Treaty of Tordesillas, this is why Brazil is Portuguese, because that line of demarcation puts Brazil on the Portuguese side. So the Portuguese are going to come there, and then the Spanish are going to be in the Caribbean. And this is going to be where slavery really gets started, where the kinds of slavery that we now know of on this side of the Americas. It's already happening off the coast of West Africa. So it's really not, that's where the majority of people are going to go overwhelmingly. 400,000 to the US. Now, this is where women's reproduction comes in, because the US and people in the US are going to reproduce, and their young are going to survive. Their children are going to survive at higher rates than people in the Caribbean and Brazil. So that means Caribbean and Brazil are going to keep bringing people in to replace the labor force that they lose through death. Whereas the United States is not going to have to do that, because their labor force is going to grow through reproduction. So again, reproduction is very central to this story, because the US is actually relying on that for much of the labor force.
Thank you. From Layla Marie Thomas, and please excuse me if I am mispronouncing your name. As an undergraduate, do you have any suggestions for how I can center humanity in my work going forward?
Oh, I love that. Yes. So again, it's an exercise in asking the question behind the statistics. So when you read work on, if you're interested in slavery, whatever you're interested in, I think it gets easier because the archives, if you're reading history, the archives get easier once, you know, more Black people are writing. So you can kind of center humanity a little bit earlier because you have people recording their thoughts. When you don't have people recording their thoughts, I think it's very easy to inadvertently fall into the kind of rhythm of talking about them. And talking around their emotions. So like I always say, that exercise and kind of asking the did with Nancy what are the emotions, the thoughts, the fears, the hopes that are motivating her, decision to allow a woman to take her child? Like, what is she thinking about when she says, hey, I need you to cure my child of this when? And then what kinds of emotions are motivating her with, and not just emotions, thoughts, intellectual preoccupations, spiritual preoccupations are motivating her when she tells this story. So it's always it's looking at the data that you have and then asking questions about the interiority of people. People often cite critical fabulation, Saidiya Hartman's idea as kind of a way to do that, kind of being more, allowing yourself to be more speculative about what you're reading. And I think it's just an exercise. It's something, as you can see, I'm constantly working on, making sure I'm not just talking about metastructures, but always localizing it and asking questions about the intimacies, the feelings, the affect behind some of the things that I can see on the page. So I think that's, again, it's just something that you have to work on little by little every time you start to write. But asking different questions about what you're reading and whether it's a secondary source or a primary source is the first step. I think one of the primary steps in kind of centering humanity. And then writing, this is the big one. Writing in a way, we do this thing where we want to talk about Black people, but then we talk about everybody else who's doing stuff to Black and not Black people. So I say, you got to center Black people. If that's who you're, or whoever, not even just whoever it is you're centering, because I think anytime you're talking about marginalized subjects who have been subjected to trauma, it's easy to center the metastructures that condition their existence and not kind of make that shift to thinking about how they navigated and how they structure their worlds, because we live in a world of violence. I live in a world of anti-Blackness, but my life is not reducible to anti-Blackness. So we can't do that to our subjects.
Thank you. From Britt Lewis Morris. From what other kinds of sources were you able to draw formerly enslaved narratives? I thought the Lomax recordings were contemporaneous with the WPA interviews.
Lomax recordings, but what are the Lomax? What did I reference something? The WPA, so I use a range of sources in my work. So again, it's about this idea that we always have to have the voices of enslaved people to tell stories about enslaved people means that you'll never really tell a lot of stories about enslaved people. So I use traveler accounts, reading. So for instance, reading 16th, 17th century traveler accounts from Upper Guinea, which is the part of West Africa that I deal with the most. But I read them against actually more contemporary anthropological sources where we do have people explaining the meanings of their practices. And again, it's not an attempt to trace origins. It's always me trying to triangulate meaning and give a broad kind of interpretive context for what people, when I read a traveler account who's just narrating what they see, I can kind of try to understand better what the subjects are doing, what the West Africans in the scene, from that view are actually doing by reading it against anthropological sources, or sometimes other sources from the same time period, or maybe around 50 years later, where you have more of an explanation of what people are doing from the traveler. So it's practices like that, reading alongside other types of sources. I also used a lot of diaries from slaveholders, because a lot of stories of enslaved women are actually in diaries of slaveholding white women. Of course, they never tell the stories from the perspectives of their enslaved women, but I can at least see the enslaved woman. She's there and I can understand her context, and then I can read that against other things I see and know to begin to narrate some of what's happening. Some slaveholder diaries like, there were some accounts. I used court petitions to talk about filicide and other kind of actions that fell into the realm of the criminal. I'm actually using those a lot now, even though incidentally, when talking about phenomena called witchcraft, they fall out after 1693. They fall out of the record of criminality in the US. So it's newspapers there. So those are just some of the sources that I use. That WPA featured prominently, but were by no means the only one. But again, one of the things I say about the WPA that I think we get wrong, again, this is one of those epistemological things. This prioritization of writing, an idea of what memory can and cannot do, is very much rooted in a Western European print-centric world. When you are talking about West and West Central Africans and people coming out of that lineage, and then people who historically have not been given access to literacy, but coming out of that lineage, their memories are different, and the way the purpose of memory is actually different. So again, it's a huge epistemological shift. So when I'm narrating history, I am attentive to how West and West Central Africans would have conceptualized and thought about history, how they would have kept their own histories. And it's remarkable when you make that shift, how neatly it aligns with how people are telling stories in the WPA narratives. They tell the same stories over and over again. And it's not because they've heard the story, because they're in radically different regions. It's because the types of stories they prioritize are very, very similar. So if you start to index that stuff, they become an incredibly reliable source.
Thank you. Since the Salem witch trials persecuted women who were accused of bewitching men, were enslaved women also accused of magic or sorcery and therefore victimized as a result of their religious practices?
That's a great question, and that speaks directly to what I'm thinking about. It's actually a yes and no kind of thing. So what you'll find, Salem witch trials, there's really only one enslaved woman of African descent who is a part of that. Her name is Candy. Tituba, of course, is a woman from the Spanish Americas. She, there are lots of kind of debates. Elaine Breslaw is the scholar who has done kind of the most work thinking about Tituba as a historical figure. Definitely an indigenous person. She is called a Spanish Indian in most of the records of the Salem witch trials, but she is very quickly Africanized within 30 years after the end of the trials, which is why she's most, Conde, of course, from I, Tituba, Black Witch of Salem. This is where you get that. It's a very strong narrative of that she is a Black woman, even though she's not. She's an enslaved woman, which there's a lot of conversation that I'm having with myself in my work about how enslaved marks someone as Black in those 30 years after Salem. And it's not by a coincidence. So because enslaved witchcraft itself falls out of the legal record as a criminal act, it is actually disavowed in what will become the United States in the North American colonies, unlike in the Caribbean, where things like obeah, they are so paranoid about obeah, it's not even funny. It's kind of hilarious because it's like, good grief, they know they're doing wrong because they always think somebody trying to do something to them, But in the US, that is not the case. And so it's a no. Yes, one of the claims I'm making in that book is, yes, the legacy of witchcraft does continue to do work racial in this gendered, racialized way, but it doesn't do it through criminal or legal kind of tributaries or structures. It does it through these discursive and kind of cultural structures. So things like literature and things like sorry, it's just a lot of chaos in my house. Sounds like my husband got up and he must be in pain because one of my kids is being asked for ice and does not understand the assignment. But yeah, so you're not going to get it in the legal record. Hold on one second. Let me just fire them. Okay, sorry. So it's a yes and a no. So you will not get them being persecuted for witchcraft, incidentally, after 1693. And really before that, it's mostly white women who are being accused because this is a very strong Western European lineage. But I do think that one of the claims I'm making and I find in my work is you have this more kind of subterranean sort of underpinning of suspicion that tends to hover over Black women's religious practices. And there's a very quick move. Witchcraft is not the language ever used, but the specter of witchcraft is always there because the suspicion of malevolent religiosity is usually there when Black women are practicing something that doesn't look like Christianity. So yes and no.
Thank you. We have 4 more questions just to give you a sense.
Oh, I'm sorry, I'm talking too loud. I can't see the questions.
It's okay. Juan Floyd Thomas, given the particular crises in which we presently find ourselves, that is the erasure of US history, what are your 3 insights for which historians and ethicists must hold true to in the project of enlightenment, cultural memory, and right relations in ushering forward a new generation of students, scholars, servant leaders, and a more perfect union in the United States of amnesia? That's from both Juan and Stacy Floyd Thomas.
Hey, Juan and Stacy.
As if you couldn't tell.
I was about to say, this is a very eloquent question. You all tell me, I don't know. Okay. I don't, that's a great question. 3 things to combat erasure. I don't know if I have 3. Maybe I can talk through. I think one of the key things is, I'm sorry, I'm writing as I think. I don't know if this would be one of the 3, but this is something it's hard, but I think the guilt has to go first, and shame. Shame and guilt are aspects, that are real in the study about, histories of Black humanity in the United States. And I think the shame is for those of us who are the descendants. I've mentioned that already. And then the guilt is those who are the perpetrators. And I think you have a lot of people who live in this liminal space between somewhere and maybe, apathy or kind of this kind of disavowal of this history. Oh, my ancestors weren't here. I think, we have to move to a place where we understand enslaved people as central contributors to the life we now are able to lead as individuals who inhabit this land called the United States. None of us could do what we do without them. I don't care what our race. I think some sort of acknowledgement of that, and I don't, it's like a long shot. I don't know if they'll ever acknowledge anything like that. I don't know how many people will. And I don't know how many even people who champion this history are willing to just outright declare the centrality of this history to what we now know of as, of the US, So I think the guilt and the shame, for those of us who want to study these histories or do these histories, I think the shame, we have to write about enslaved people as the good, the bad, and the ugly, going back to Dean Townsend's. We have to write about them as complex individuals, humans. Humans are never universally good. I can't tell you how many instances of domestic violence I see in those records. It's hard to read. But they are people who were in this amazingly traumatic and violent situation. Why do we think there wouldn't be violence among them? You know, I think one of the things we do as religious studies scholars, at least I see in the scholarship, and which is why I'm really interested in witchcraft now and how people were doing stuff that they most often wielded it against one another. That's a real thing, you know, and it's not a bad thing. It's a human thing. You know, and if we're going to understand enslaved people, Black people as human, we got to let Black people be human. We got to, you know, and I think Tyree Nichols is that. There are awful Black people who have internalized oppression and racism, and they walk among us and they do stuff to each other, to us, you know, and that's real. You know, I think that's as real as, you know, the amazing, you know, creativity and resilience and, justice-oriented work that has been done by Black Americans. So I think, you know, for me, it's about accepting, allowing Black people to be fully complex humans who have a range of emotions and problems, who have mental health problems, who are violent and not violent, you know, who are at the spectrum of what humans can be. And then I think that the last thing I would say is this, the memory. And I think that's a hard thing. Let me just say, the last thing I just said only works if we get past the shame, because I think a part of what we do out of our shame is tell stories that always lift Black people up. And we like all feel the weight when we feel we let each other down, you know? And that's, I don't know if that'll go away, but I feel like for our own sanity, our own humanity, for our own assertion of our humanity, we got to let it go. Because we just got to let it go. Me, Black people, but also the larger people have to let go this understanding Black people as like individual Black people as synecdoches, you know, we are not parts of a whole. We're just parts, you know, like we are just individuals. And then the thing about memory, I think the last thing I would say is about memory. I think we just have to tell history differently, and we have to push back on an academy that wants sources printed and who doesn't honor the orality of what we do and who we are, of who Black people have been for a long time, you know, and again, like my work right now on what's called witchcraft, like a lot, you know, you go home with me right now to Florida, and yes, everybody knows, like I'm from the place where like I grew up on the river, there are gators, like there, you know, everybody knows my gator stories. I am from Florida. Gators in my backyard, and my whole family is on the river. And I think about my mother, who like when she hears a owl hoot 3 times, many of us have heard this, you hear a owl hooting 3 times, oh, somebody's gonna die. You know, it's just like a normal thing, you know, or I saw your grandfather yesterday. My grandfather's been dead for 13 years. She's like, your grandfather was here yesterday. I could smell him. He was worried about this. You know, we have to take that seriously and unapologetically study that as religion, because it is, you know, it is, or maybe the category of religion is not worthy of whatever that is. You know, that's my whole thing. Like, do we even need it? Like, we have created things that defy these categories, and just allowing them to defy those categories and define them ourselves as scholars when we tell these histories, and speaking back to an academy that says, you don't have the sources for this. So how are you telling this story? You know, I think, at least for me, I mean, Juan, Stacy, y'all go ahead. You can answer this question. I don't know. Like I think we have to do it together. But those are my starting points. That's a great question too. Thank you.
There are 3 questions in the queue, and I'm going to read the 3.
Okay, and I'll answer all 3 quickly.
Yes. From Herbert Marbury. Do you see evidence of biblical scriptures playing a role in the construction of the regimes of knowledge and the consequent discursive violence that act in constructing enslaved women as other? From Jim Hudnut Boimler. If your argument is, in part, everyone has an interiority, not just per Maslow, elevated, emancipated people, then I wonder what different depth of interiority did Black women possess materially and spiritually under conditions, especially of having offspring subject to slavery. And then two side notes. One, profound talk tonight. And two, miss you in Nashville. And then finally, Layla Marie Thomas. Personally, I've always been dumbfounded by the brutality of slavery and the slave economy. The only way I could rationalize it is the economic incentive and dehumanization occurred as a way to rationalize the crimes. As a person who studies the history of slavery, do you really believe that whites believed the Black people were inherently less human? How is that really possible?
Okay, thank you. Hey, first, hey, her. Good to, I wish I could see everybody. Gosh, I'm coming in the summer. The kids I am already looking for tickets to come to Nashville. And I miss Nashville too, Jim. I really do. I miss the pace of life. Californians think they're so relaxed, but honestly, it's like New York just on the West Coast. It's just everybody's anxious. It's New York with a beach. Okay, so first question, biblical scriptures, regimes. I was trying to type it very quickly. Write it. Yes. So some that I think are like the one with Eve and the curse of Ham. It's interesting. Those are the two. I don't know if I can say scriptures. You certainly have people who use biblical narratives and figures as archetypes to justify enslavement that we all know about, but the regimes of knowledge, that's what I wrote down in regards to that question. And thinking about how biblical scriptures, that is a great question. One of the things I want to say, I wonder, that's a really good question. I think they're definitely implicated when we talk about the discursive structures that are birthed in this moment to justify these hierarchies. But the regimes of knowledge, that kind of deeper part that you're asking about, that's the question for you. Right? I honestly don't know. I would have to really think about that because that's a really good question. And I've never thought about that. I usually think, as you can tell, just kind of more on the surface side of how people are using the biblical scriptures to justify these larger structures, kind of going down to Layla's question. So I don't know about the regimes of knowledge and kind of the structures of knowledge that I'm kind of really trying to point to. I don't know how the biblical scriptures are kind of implicated in that. But I'd be interested to talk to you about what you think, because that's your realm. But I think it's a really important question, because if you could help me answer that, I think it would just kind of blow things out of the water with how we think about religion and slavery, because that intersection with kind of scripture is one that I kind of, beyond just kind of the discourse, it's one that I kind of struggle with. So it's a great question, and it's like I don't know. Jim, I miss you too. I'm so happy you're on the call, and I wish I could say hello. The different sort of interiority that Black, I think they had a very, I don't know if it was different. The interiority itself, of course, is conditioned by the material conditions. And I think, I always say it was overwhelmingly pragmatic and focused and one of the things I think about is kind of the ways that I don't think this is not an innate thing, but the conditions of woman gendered experience in slavery was such that they had to understand and think about themselves in of relationships. They could not, and that's why they didn't run away often, because I don't think it's that they couldn't run away. It's just, that is how they thought about, that was how they structured many of them did, not all. They structured their worlds as kind of a part of a constellation. That's how their personhood was kind of defined. And I don't think it was just them. I do think that enslaved men did it too, because most enslaved men didn't run. But I do think, because I know enslaved women, I think about this subset more. So I think because the material conditions of their lives made it so that they were the people who were responsible for child rearing, they were the people who were responsible for the sick in these settings, they were the people who oftentimes cared for the elderly. Because of that, their interiority was deeply relational. That's why survival and quality of life that, the late, great Dolores Williams talked about is so right. It is so right, because survival is incredibly pragmatic. Quality of life is about relationality. How do I create a better situation for myself and the people around me? And that's how their interiority, I think, a lot of what they thought about, a lot of the decisions they made, I noticed this kind of thread of relationality when I was doing that work. And even now, when I'm studying different forms of medicine, and also violence, they oftentimes are wielding this violence in retaliation for something. It was never offensive, it was always, or defensive. So you still have that relational edge. So their interiority to me just feels deeply relational. But I do think enslaved people as a whole had a lot of relational interiority. And I don't know, I think that's what I would say. And then to Layla's question, no, they didn't understand them to be less than human. You're absolutely right. I always say histories of sexual violence and coercion show us they knew they were human. And I think the harder question, it goes back to the question the Floyd Thomases asked earlier. I think the more difficult thing is, what does it mean for us to talk about in the histories of slavery, understanding that these were humans doing this to other humans? Because I think the dehumanization piece is a cop-out. It's actually easier to say they dehumanize enslaved people. It makes us, it makes people of African descent feel good, because the shame kind of goes away, because they didn't even think of us as human, and we know we're human. And then it kind of does this, it kind of reduces the culpability of those who were enslaving, and those, not just who were enslaving, but those who were complicit in the structures of violence. But when we say, no, they did not actually dehumanize people. They knew these people were human. They saw the tears. They saw the violence. They knew the effects of their violence. They knew it. And I can tell you from the sources they knew. So what then? What emotions do we have to deal with then? What histories do we have to deal with then, when we acknowledge that the narrative of the dehumanization is absolutely a fiction? There are very few people who said, oh, these people aren't human. They would say that, and then they would go have sex with them. So they knew they were human. And again, moving past the rhetoric, moving past what the sources say, what are people doing? That's what we can see. They're doing something other than what they're saying they're doing. So let's study the doing, and then we can see what they actually, how they actually feel. So I think that's a part of the legacy, the part of the Floyd Thomas's question, kind of moving past, how do we, these erasures, we've got to tell the story in a way that is true to how people lived it. And we got to tell it in the registers that are true to how they lived it. So yeah.
much, much to ponder. And also a spirited invitation of sorts for us to do our work better and more deeply and more thoughtfully. And an invitation to all to really look for the truths that might be found when exploring the history of this country or any country or peoples. Thank you so much. This has been a bittersweet homecoming because you're not here physically, but the power jumps out through the screen. So thank you, thank you, thank you. There are many folks, both in the chat and in Q&A, thanking you for your lecture and your time with us. We normally have this little ceremony we do where we present you with a framed poster for your lecture that was developed, but we will send that your way, and we owe you a dinner. So
thank you. Now, and I want to say, Carol, for those of you who know my husband, many of you know Carol actually apologized before he had surgery. Yes, he's like, I tell everybody at Vandy, I am so sorry that you could not come. But he is doing, well, he had surgery this morning, and barring the reaction to the anesthesia, he's doing well. So, thank you for allowing me to give this lecture virtually so I could, support him through this injury. So
as you know, I believe family needs to come first on some days, and family over a lecture, that's no contest. But thank you for taking time out in the midst of family and all that goes on. With that, folks, I want to thank everyone who joined us this evening, and look forward to seeing you in another few weeks as we celebrate the Antoinette Jones lecture. The date escapes me. Antoinette Brown. Shatika, the date is?
March 20th at 7 p.m. with Dr. Tracy West.
Yes. So please all have a safe night and be good to yourselves and do take care. Blessings all.